Welcome back to Off the Pitch, the podcast where we chat with individuals working within and shaping the game of soccer from off the pitch. Today's guest is Calen Carr. Calen is currently an in-studio analyst and matchday broadcaster for MLS Season Pass on Apple TV. We chat with Calen about how he went from playing in MLS Cup finals to interviewing MLS greats and everything in between. His desire to bring untold stories to light really resonated with us, and I know it will with you too. So let's jump into it. All right, Calen, welcome to the podcast. I know we've done a little bit of digging on who you are and your background and your career so far. But for those that don't know who you are and that don't watch the MLS Season Pass week in, week out, can you kind of give everyone a rundown of how you started and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me on, David, Matt. Awesome to be here. Yeah, appreciate the opportunity. And my story, I'm a Bay Area guy. So grew up in Berkeley, Northern California, and kind of played all sports growing up, but soccer took just kind of clicked for me. I remember just going to a Mercy soccer camp as I think 5-year-old or something really young, and I wanted to go back the next week, and before I knew it, I think I'd gone 9 weeks in a row, and that was kind of it. I just kept running. So at least that's the way my mom describes it to me. My mom is a professor at UC Berkeley, and so I kind of grew up on campus and was a big sports fan of all those teams, and then I got lucky to be able to go to UC Berkeley and played there for 4 years under Kevin Grimes. And that was kind of the first time that I was like, oh, I think I've seen some other players go pro. There were some guys like Chris Roner that went to San Jose Earthquakes, and we started scrimmaging against the San Jose Earthquakes during the spring season. And that was with like Landon Donovan and Brian Ching and Dwayne DiRosario and Jeff Agas and all these legends of the game. And that was the first time I kind of got to test myself, and I was like, maybe I could do this. And got an opportunity. In actually before I went to MLS, I got an opportunity to try to go to Europe as well. So I had a stint on trial at Arsenal and then Club Bruges, and so both were amazing experiences. And then came back to the US, ended up going to MLS instead, and playing for 8 years between two clubs, five in Chicago, three in Houston. Had a great career from my standpoint. Of course, everybody, once you get to that level, you want to keep pushing on and see how long you can go. I had some injuries that cut it a little bit shorter than I would have liked, but really enjoyed my time. I had some winning teams and went to two MLS Cups with the Dynamo, and then moved on to media afterwards. And now involved every week traveling to different cities, calling matches as a match analyst. I work in the studio as well here in New York City, where I live in Brooklyn. And yeah, that's the sort of streamlined version of it. Of course, it's a more winding road, I'm sure, than it might sound, but that's kind of how I ended up where I am today, and just really feel lucky and happy to still be involved in the game and seeing how the course of the soccer culture is changing. And I think you guys have an awesome show. Love what you guys are doing, and I'm always interested not so much only in what happens on the pitch every week, but I think off the pitch. Um, Plug for the name of your guys' show. It's just I think that's such a big part of the game and the culture around it and the people that are kind of working day to day to try to build the sport in this country.
Yeah, definitely. And that's exactly the point of the show. Like we're just trying to kind of shine a light on the unsung heroes of the sport, those who work behind the scenes to make everything happen week in, week out. But kind of moving back towards your career a little bit, whether it was during your career or right after your career as a professional player, you obviously kind of jumped right into the media world, and I just want to touch on like how did you develop that interest? Like how did you decide that that's what you wanted to do once you were done? Was that something that happened like while you were playing? You were like, hey, like the people capturing content for us, so I like what they do, or seeing what's going on behind the scenes, or was that something that you knew from the beginning?
I was always interested in media, and I just in little things. I wrote for the student newspaper in high school. I then when I went to Berkeley, I was a media studies major, and I knew right away that I wanted to do that. So that was what my degree is. Although I have to say I wasn't at that time thinking, oh, I'm gonna work in soccer media. I just thought this was like um, an interesting kind of realm that I wanted to explore. And then while I was playing, I always took on the opportunities, I would say, to be involved in the media aspect of it. So I remember my rookie year, I got asked by Chicago Fire to do like a blog. And I said yes. And I was a little bit nervous about it because as a rookie, I was pretty nervous about saying the wrong thing or what I have to do. And I used it more as an opportunity where I was able to be smart about it. And I'd say, hey, thank you to CJ Brown. He's been such a good roommate on the road. And I don't know if I was being strategic or I'm not trying to be calculated or anything, but I was genuinely interested in media from the beginning. But I wanted to manage to make sure that I wasn't putting myself in a bad position. And I think that that was kind of how it was at MLS at the time was it wasn't really cool to be doing media or to be interested in media. I felt the culture was much more like, not don't do media. It's better to say no to different opportunities, which was a little bit against how I was feeling. So I had to kind of bide my time and wait. Whereas now I think it's much more common to see players with like podcasts or taking those opportunities. But as time went on, I had some injuries, as I mentioned, and that's really when I started to dive a little bit deeper into doing some more media opportunities. And because I had always said yes to these opportunities over the years, CSN Houston asked me while I was injured and said, "Hey, you've come on a bunch of our shows. We really like you. Why don't you come into the studio sometime and check it out? Maybe we can throw you on some of our shows, Dynamo Weekly." And I was like, "Absolutely, that sounds great." I'm just sitting in here doing knee rehab every day, and it's boring, and this is tough, and this gives me something else to focus on in this time. And just over time, I think saying yes to different things, even in Spanish, like I took Spanish growing up in the Bay Area. Um, you speak Spanish in soccer fields, classrooms, everywhere you go in the Bay Area, and in locker rooms in MLS. I played with players that didn't speak English all the time, and so sometimes I remember in CONCACAF Champions League, we went to Panama and none of the Latin guys wanted to do interviews. And the team PR comm staff came over and were like, "Hey, Calen, I know your Spanish isn't perfect, but would you be open to doing an interview?" And I was like, "Who is this with?" And they're like, "It's with I don't remember who it was, but somebody in Panama." And I was like, nobody I know in Panama is going to see this. So I might as well take a shot here and try and work on my Spanish and do an interview. And I think those were the types of things that eventually down the road when I interviewed Chicharito when he signed in MLS, and I got to fly to Spain and I interviewed him in Spanish and English. And those are the types of things that I eventually was able to kind of like build towards, even if I didn't know I was building towards it. And I still need to work on my Spanish for sure. But I think there was always an interest, and I wasn't sure how it was going to kind of end up. But I think I more than anything kind of just followed that interest and instinct, and ended up, I think, being beneficial in the long term for me.
That's awesome. I mean, not many people get to do kind of their dream from the start and then continue on with their kind of further dream afterwards. That's really unique, and like I know a lot of people would love to just accomplish anything that they want to do.
Thanks, man.
I know a little bit about kind of we skipped over, but when you were talking about your career, we skipped over a lot of the stuff in between when you just jumped into media versus how you got to where you are now. I know you've done a few things. Specifically, there's one project called The Movement, which has kind of lasted a number of years, and that is kind of a much deeper storytelling project of yours. Do you mind kind of diving deep into the movement and kind of what that meant to you?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first finished playing, it actually started with an independent project that I was doing where I moved back to the Bay Area from Houston, and I was trying to figure out whether I was gonna continue my career. I was out of contract. I didn't know if I was going to get another opportunity. I wasn't fully fit because I was recovering from an injury from the prior year, an MLS Cup, no less. So it was kind of like a big sort of unknown time where I really didn't know what was going to come next for me. And during that time, I started amidst my rehab and amidst trying to get fit and healthy again, I was also starting to do some writing and exploring some storytelling. So, an example was I started a social media project during the 2014 World Cup. And so I interviewed often a number of guys that I had played with or had connections to. So, Jeff Cameron, who was at the World Cup in Brazil. We took some photos of his tattoos leading up to the World Cup, and I interviewed him on a story about like how his family was woven into what he was wearing on his tattoo sleeve and going up and representing his country on the biggest stage in the world. And um, I was really more interested in kind of the stories kind of behind the game. And Brian Ching was the first Hawaiian player to make a World Cup team on the men's side. And I happened to be going to Hawaii anyways for a friend's wedding. And I went and had dinner with his mom, Stevie, who had been at a bunch of Houston Dynamo games, of course. And my mom and his mom were close friends. And so I went to dinner at her place and she showed me some old photos of Chingy that were pretty funny. And uh, I would talk to her about the story of going from Hawaii and Ching going from Hawaii, the North Shore of Oahu, to the World Cup in his case. And so I was going all across the board of like different players, even from other countries, Costa Rica, of guys that I had played with. And that was really kind of a new opening for me where I was like, oh, I think I really want to get into some storytelling. And so eventually, as I was writing more, MLS reached out to me and they said, hey, would you be interested in coming to New York and trying some on camera stuff? Meanwhile, I was desperate to try some on camera stuff and not finding a lot of opportunities. But I played it cool and I was like, yeah, I'd be open to that. Yeah, that sounds good. And went out there and like the first thing I did on camera was I did two things that week. One was an interview with Mehdi Bellucci, who was a close friend from growing up in the Bay Area. And at the time, he was playing really well for New York City. So that was the easy one because I was like, Mehdi, you got to come do an interview with me. And he was great and really open. And then the other one was a interview at the Steve Nash Showdown. But at the showdown was like Stu Holden, Jeff Cameron, Jada Merritt, a bunch of guys that I knew already too. So that helped me kind of get a foot in the door with a few opportunities. And then eventually the movement really came out of conversations with MLS saying, hey, I'd really like to do some more storytelling. And there was this guy, Michael Milberger, who really was the one who gave me the opportunity and was directing the video content at the time there. And um, it was a chance to really travel and go around to MLS markets and tell the stories of players, cities, fans, but not just what we see on TV on a match day, but more about the supporter culture or the stories of players that maybe come from unlikely places that have brought this unique background and culture into a locker room, which was always something that I really enjoyed the most of playing in MLS was like getting to see a Scottish player and a Jamaican guy on a fantasy football team, and going to dinner with one, and then going to a Honduran barbecue and speaking in Portuguese to a Brazilian player, and like just having all these different interactions and connection points that I think helped become what the movement show was. So the show's still available. It's on Apple TV, MLS Season Pass. You can check out the last season of it. and then also on YouTube as well. So I think those type of stories are important in trying to grow the game, and it was super fun just to go around and share a little bit of my perspective of, I guess, what I had lived in my MLS experience, and then try to bring it to a broader audience to maybe be a little bit more interested in what's going on in MLS, not just what's happening on the pitch too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's anytime there's a documentary, when you even look at like Wrexham or Sunderland Till I Die or fill in the blank of any of these documentaries, the more interesting part is always like the shots of them at home talking to their wives or their kids, where you can like disconnect them from being the player that's on the pitch and actually kind of remember that they're actual people behind, you know, those players. So that's awesome. One thing that I was curious when I was reading about you is where you sort of, and I guess beyond, you know, your degree that you had that I'm sure influenced it quite a bit, but was there any resources you went to sort of learn the art of storytelling, or did you just kind of run with the ideas you had in your mind and just sort of refine that over time with each project?
Yeah, it sounds, I think the second is definitely the part that it was, because while the degree was good, I think it makes it sound like I trained for this when really I didn't. I think the real training came from doing, and I think that's the same thing I experienced playing was, um, it's really about just learning by doing. And I think that time that I had where I was unsure or not knowing what I was going to do next, I had no oversight. It was just me on vacation in Hawaii, or it was me back in the Bay at a coffee shop trying to figure out what story was interesting next, or just following a little bit of your instinct and then trusting that it's maybe unique or different or insightful. But then the craft part, I think, was something that I am still learning. And that was a part where I think surrounding yourself with good people really helps. So for the movement, for example, I worked with a few guys that had worked in documentary storytelling already. And so they were able to take what I had as the insight and connections and understanding and help shape that into what a story is. And then eventually I took on more ownership of, I'm going through the tape, I'm creating a paper edit. I'm now overseeing a lot of the process of how we're putting these stories together and who we want to interview and where and how that creates a larger narrative. But that came with time. And the other part that I thought was helpful for me was none of these people that I worked with came from the soccer space specifically. And that's been something that I think is was helpful in a sense of like making the show feel different than maybe a traditional soccer story that you see. And I think you mentioned the documentaries and that style of storytelling, like Wrexham or Sunderland Till I Die, and those feel like they have a feel of that feels real and maybe different than maybe a more polished story that we tend to see in sports documentaries. The guys that I worked with had worked at Vice or had worked at High Times. Like they were working at very different types of outlets and publications and in film and TV. And so I thought the idea of somebody who'd maybe worked in music and shot music videos could bring something unique that wouldn't necessarily be, or I'd be like, oh, they didn't know who Josie Altidore was. So there wasn't like they were cool with everybody and really open and interested and ended up becoming real soccer people, but it didn't begin with that necessarily. And I think sometimes adding in a fresh perspective to the mix can really elevate a project or make it feel unique and different than a lot of the kind of like, all right, we're going to go out and film training and we're going to film the game and then we're going to splice this into a scene or a story, as opposed to being a little bit more creative or avant-garde or just outside the box of what we traditionally see in sports, which I tend to gravitate to at least.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure there's obviously a huge benefit of being passionate about the context of what you're shooting and telling a story to, but I'm sure it's helpful to have people who might not have that necessary passion on the topic, but just have the passion on like the craft behind building that story, and just loving the process side of things rather than like getting starstruck by the people in front of you if you are a huge Jose Altidore fan.
Yeah,
um,
definitely. But I was
I
like,
guess.
also, you should know who Josie Altidore is. Like, come on, get it
Yeah,
together.
yeah, and I guess now, like following up from that, now that you have this experience of storytelling and in different projects and telling different stories, what in your mind, I guess, if you were to now be teaching the art of storytelling, what are those sort of key ingredients behind a good story and being able to capture a good story and actually package it all together in a way that people can, you know, feel an emotion to?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I don't know if I'm ready to teach yet. I feel like I'm still learning. But I would say the things that I've learned over time, to begin with, I felt like finding something that feels unique and different that catches your attention. And I think it's less for me. The most interesting stories, and I think the most interesting people are not always the most famous, or the biggest names. And sometimes you don't get the most out of them either, too. So finding a unique story, a unique individual, and somebody that's willing to show a little bit, or go a little bit deeper. And eventually I felt like people started reaching out to me to be like, hey, I've got this story, or suddenly I've got this thing I'm working on that I really would love to shine a light on. And I'm like, oh, yes, absolutely. Um, and then I think the other part too is like that I've learned over time more is to try to find some conflict within the story. And I think that was a little tricky for me at first, because the conflict part can be touchy, and not always easy to say. And it doesn't have to be some sort of huge controversy necessarily, but even just the internal conflict within a character of how they navigate a situation, or what's the piece of their story, like mine, where I can say, well, I worked in media, and now I work for MLS on Apple TV, MLS Season Pass, and I'm doing all this cool stuff. But like, what about that year when you didn't know what you were doing and you were dealing with that injury? Like, that's where I've begun to kind of try to mine more for um, kind of the sticky part that might be a little bit uncomfortable for people. And if you find a willing participant, you can find something that is like a little bit of a deeper truth to pull out when you find it. But yeah, I definitely don't think I've figured it all out as of yet. But I'm always looking to learn and find new people to work with, and good stories. I keep like a log of stories that I'm always tracking, even if I'm not. I'm doing more live commentary and studio analyst work and diving deeper into the matches, which has been great. But I'm always keeping an eye out for some of the stories that I can either bring into the commentary when I can, although I don't know if it's the best format for that. But always keeping an eye out for opportunities for when those lights switch on and I do get a chance to do more of that. It's something I would love to get back to at some point.
Definitely a lot of your stories that I've seen through our research, and obviously kind of tracking your progress as because I knew you a little bit as a player and kind of seeing you grow as a media, just within media. A lot of your work has been kind of bringing to light those untold stories, and kind of making people have those uncomfortable conversations with themselves. And so that's one of the things I wanted to ask about is, what do you really like enjoy about bringing those stories and conversations to light? Like, what do you enjoy about that?
That's a good question. I think in some ways it comes from an idea that not everybody is going to connect to the game the same way. And so I've heard a number of your guys' podcasts, and everybody has a unique story as far as how they kind of fell in love with soccer or football or whatever you want to call it. Some of it might be their family, where they grew up in another country, or some of it might be because they were a player and then they got injured and then decided to take a different route. some might be a video game. I heard the one you guys did with Eric Beard and his work with EA. I know Eric well too, and so it might be fashion. Like there's so many different access points into the game, and I think sometimes the untold stories are one important just to kind of document. Like I don't know, I think about St. Louis, for example, and it'd be easy to turn on the TV today and say, "Oh, St. Louis City is like the newest team in Major League Soccer." And wow, this is just like any other new expansion team. But there's such a deep history in St. Louis that I don't know you if you can take for granted that MLS fans who are living in, Austin, Texas, or living in San Jose know about the history of St. Louis when they turn on the TV. And so I think that story of understanding that the 1950 World Cup, their U.S. national team beat England 1-0 in the World Cup in Uruguay, I think it was, and five of the players were from the same neighborhood in St. Louis, and that it's like one of the original soccer cities of the U.S. And that's like a really cool hidden context that I think is helpful to understanding why St. Louis is packed when you turn on the match in that stadium, and that there's a underground kind of culture and history for a long time through this Italian neighborhood called the Hill that I've gone to and visited on my trip there earlier this season. And so I think just like it can help grow the game, it can help give important context, and it can be a pathway into where you're watching a St. Louis City match, or maybe flipping through the channels and you're saying, I don't know, why do I want to stick to this match? But if you see and you've spoken to a player, or you have a different access point into it, or you understand why the fans are singing that particular song, like that's what I think is drawn to me in understanding, like, you know, why some clubs across the world matter in different ways, or in my travels, or things like that. And I think we have to do our part to tell those types of stories about the game in our country too, because it is younger in some ways, or in a lot of ways, and our league is for sure, but there is history there. And I think that it's just not always obvious, or sometimes a little bit hidden.
Yeah, I think especially on the global scale, the history of soccer within our country is definitely hidden and not known about. Like a lot of people know about some stuff, like for example, Pele coming to play for the New York Cosmos, or some of a bunch of the other European players doing the kind of the same thing during those days in the NASL way back in the day. But there's a lot of other stuff. Like we just interviewed 2 weeks ago the president of the Charleston Battery, and we spoke to him about how they have to live up to the rich history of their club because they're the longest continuously operating club in the U.S. and they're only in the USL Championship. It's not an MLS team, which it's a lot of people would completely overlook that, and they wouldn't begin to see like, oh, there's layers here. It's not just the MLS. There's a lot of history going on with like grassroots stuff and a bunch of other things going on, especially with the Open Cup. And that's a lot of turmoil going on this year too that we don't want to get into. But yeah, and then kind of on the flip side of the stuff that you do, you mentioned one earlier, but you've definitely done two of the kind of the biggest name interviews in MLS history, and that's the Galaxy when they signed Zlatan, and the Galaxy again when they signed Chicharito. Um, Very kind of opposite of your kind of historical storytelling and what you had been doing. What do you do to kind of change your mindset or prepare for an interview like that as opposed to one of your normal projects?
Yeah, those are different because, I reference like having access, or even personal relationships with a lot of the subjects, or willing participants. And when you go to interview Zlatan, you don't really know what to expect. And I would recommend not looking up his past history of interviews in preparation to that. Normally that'd be the first thing I would tell someone to do, is like, oh, go get a sense of who they are as a person, how they act during interviews. I would say in this case, avoid that because there's like a bunch of reels now or YouTube compilation videos of Zlatan interviews, and now my interviews is a big part of that because his interview was yeah, it was interesting. It was pretty fun and also just the strangest experience. The other piece of this that I don't know if I've spoken about before is the Galaxy hired a real life lion for the announcement of Zlatan. So on the day that I interviewed Zlatan in the same place, there was a real lion that came to the shoot for the first half of the day. And so that was the morning. I have my coffee. This lion gets backed up in a truck in Manchester into this huge soundstage area that is built out a cage within it. And this lion comes out with this lion tamer, and he's telling us like no flash photography whatsoever because I am in here with this lion with a big piece of meat on the edge of a stick. And he was having the lion walk down, and they were going to simulate it. So the lion walks and then it becomes Zlatan's feet through, the special effects. And so I'm sitting in there, and honestly, I was like, that was scary. I was like, this is a rush. This lion was massive. Its name was the Artist, which was a strange name for a lion, but he starts the first half of the day, and then I'm also halfway preparing or finishing my prep for the interview with Zlatan. And he came in and was so pumped up about this lion. Like he knew everything about the lion. He was looking at its feet and he's like, oh yeah, he looks about 9 years old and I was like, damn, this guy really knows his stuff here and has like a lion tattoo on his back and had called himself, I think, the lion and all that. So but the interview, I had some pretty basic questions, honestly. Why is this the right time to come to MLS? Things like that. And the I just mostly got out of the way. And especially if you're interviewing somebody like Zlatan, he had a few dramatic pauses where I thought he might be done and I was getting ready to ask the next question. And I just waited for him because one, I didn't want to interrupt Zlatan. I think that would be a bad idea. But then he just kept going and the stuff he was saying was like, I've come to conquer America, like I conquered all of Europe. And there were just some really good sound bites that came out of that, of course, that ended up kind of going viral and being this whole thing. But my main advice would be to just like get out of the way. And I think in general, with storytelling in general, um, using silence or allowing the subject to speak sometimes you can get a little bit more out of them. And for someone like that, like especially the big name guys, sometimes you have to know if you're going to need to draw something out of somebody. But in this case, this guy was like, top class, one of the best interviews you'll ever see in any sport ever. And some controversy surrounding it. But that's, I think, part of the intrigue and part of what was interesting about him in MLS was even when he was critical of MLS and referees or whatever it might be, I thought that was interesting and it made MLS more a part of the conversation globally. And not many players can do that. But Zlatan was definitely unique. And that whole experience of like going from the Lion to then interviewing him was kind of crazy.
I mean, with Zlatan, the biggest thing with him is this like aura, right,
Yeah.
that surrounds him. So I guess just like separating, your style or anything for this next question, just out of pure curiosity, like because obviously I've watched the interview twice, before prepping for this, and he just seems like this like mythical character.
Yeah.
And obviously you see it in camera, and I know David has spent time around him at the Galaxy training pitch and like just being around him as a person. But when he's in that interview, did a person like him, did he feel like he was sort of playing this character or like putting this like mask on for the interview? Or is that just like honestly how he just seems as a person?
I honestly couldn't tell. Yeah, I was trying to figure that out in the interview where I was almost like I was almost waiting for him to give a wry smile or to chuckle or something or for me to laugh, but then he looked at me just dead. He very rarely looked at me. He was mostly staring off into space, and and then and his size also. Dave, you're not a small dude, but this dude is enormous. He's like 6'5", and he made me look like a third grader sitting on the stool next to him. And but every time I thought he would maybe, give a wink or a nod, he would just stare at the end of his question like he was done now and just stare at me. And I was like, all right, no, I guess he's for real. He means that. And that was the cool part about Zlatan too, was like he said all these crazy things, but then he went and did it. Like that was a week before that first El Tráfico that I then flew to LA for and watched him immediately come on and score that goal from, I don't even know, 30, 40 yards out. And then score again later. It's just like, that was, I was like, oh no, he was serious. He was not joking. And so that's the interesting part about Zlatan, is like the line between kind of like real and truth and fiction is pretty slim for him. And like the character overall, I think he's a real guy, and like he was very polite to everybody he showed up, who he worked with throughout the entire shoot that day. He showed up by himself, no entourage, in a Volvo, like Swedish car, but it was not, there was nothing flashy about it. And I think from the experience, I know that there were some issues, and you hear some stuff about, his relationship with teammates in the locker room, but I've heard a lot of really good things about him as well too. So, yeah, he's pretty unique, but yeah, I really couldn't tell you honestly, even from going through that. I think he wanted to keep a little bit of that mystery of saying, and I think for him, that character, there's like a part of that is actually him. It's not just for TV.
Yeah, I mean Matt touched on it earlier, but I just want to kind of second that. Like, I've also heard this stuff about him not being the greatest teammate and whatnot, but he would push his teammates to the limit because he wanted them to be there. But with their families and everybody outside of the team, he was always super nice and polite. And now, obviously, you've kind of taken a different step into the more being on the live broadcasts and in the booth week by week. What has that kind of looked like from your perspective, kind of changing your day-to-day, just work day or even on a work week? Because obviously travel is a huge aspect of all of this. So like, what does it look like, and what does your prep look like when you're commentating on 4 different teams in 2 weeks, and then also have to do the analysis as well for the entire weekend?
Yeah, Leagues Cup was crazy. I'd say that much. I think for everybody working on the project, and players, managers, I think supporters, definitely from the media side, within the scope of like a few weeks, I did CF Montreal against Atletico San Luis, turned around, did Red Bull against Toronto FC, 2 teams that I've done a bunch this year. So that was a little bit more straightforward process. Then I went to St. Louis, as I mentioned. I hadn't done them so far. I'd never been there to do a match yet. Did them against FC Juarez. That was actually the day after, I forgot one. That was the day after I did Club America against Aston Villa in a Leagues Cup showcase. So it's like, we're not even now we're like in the span of a weekend. Then I went to Cincinnati. I did Cincinnati against Santos Laguna, then ended up going back to LA to do Club America against St. Louis. So at least by that point, I had, seen those teams recently at least, but within the span of a weekend, I did like 2 different leagues. Yeah, no, 3 different leagues with Villa, Club America, Juarez, and St. Louis. So, and each one you're going through. The worst part for me was like Club America and Aston Villa both made like 9 halftime changes. So you're like scrambling, being like, what number? And nobody's telling you really like who's playing where or what. So I'm going deep into the preseason roster of Villa to see how their shape is going to change in the second half. So, but that part's been really fun, I would say. The preparation side, it's like much deeper. It's much more comprehensive, where if you're working in the studio, you don't have time to like go deep into the depth chart, or to go down into like the MLS Next Pro results or roster or youth academy players that are going to get their opportunity and the tactics, like really getting a sense of how a team wants to play. I think the good part for me is I've done a number of teams now, and being up close and impersonal, I would say like it's amazing. I used to watch games not on TV or not in doing this commentary. It is amazing how much you can learn and how much information you can retain if you don't have your phone on you. And I just realized how much when I'm watching like Arsenal play on the weekend, anything that happens, I'm checking Twitter, X or whatever. I'm always like seeing the reaction to every call, or somebody texts me, a group chat buzzes, and I'm not actually really watching the game and consuming a lot of it. And so every weekend I'm watching the game intensely. I'm watching multiple matches leading up to the match to figure out how this team plays. I get to interview the managers from each team, which is hugely helpful for the most part, as far as a lot of them being very open to discussing how they want to set up their team, how they are approaching the match. There's a lot of trust involved in that you keep that close to the vest, but also it does help a lot to understand their decision making and then to be able to react in real time to what's happening. But the biggest thing I've learned from doing these matches overall is that you can't control the way the game goes. So you can do all the prep that you want and say, well, this striker is really the story for me. And I've done this before, especially early on, where I'm like, man, I'm gonna watch Chicho Arango. I'm gonna watch him up close. I'm gonna see, he's gonna be the story of this match. And then you go do the match and something completely different happens and he doesn't really have much to say. And so all that prep just goes out the window, and maybe you can save it and use it for another day and all that's fine. So I think just being present to letting the match decide. And again, it goes from the standpoint of like, don't try to be the center of attention. And I think for me, it's less about I want to give good analysis, but the match should never be about the analyst or be about the broadcast team. And then the other big part is I've had really similarly to I spoke about the features. I've had really good people around me. This guy, Callum Williams, is my play-by-play co-commentator that I work with, and he's like immensely experienced. He's from Birmingham, so he's a huge Aston Villa supporter. So doing one of their matches was a big treat and also super helpful for me because he knows like he could go down deep into the youth academy and tell me exactly who's playing what and where and what Unai Emery is going to do. And so um, but I think those are some of the things that I've learned so far. But I've really been enjoying it and trying to take it seriously, like I have with the other types of projects I've worked on, especially because it's new for me.
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of going straight into another one is because it is a little bit new for you, and you've had your media journey now for a number of years. What are kind of the key things that you've learned on your journey that you kind of try and take with you into the booth, and you try and embody those things from either people or just aspects of it that you've learned through your career?
I try to approach this similar to the way that I would approach my playing career as well too, in the standpoint of like I mentioned watching CJ Brown as a rookie. And I'm not going to say that I'm not trying to yeah, I think I might be older than Stu, but Stu's been, doing this forever at the highest level. And so I watch his games, and now with a different eye and a different ear. So I see how he approaches different situations. I've chatted with him. I've chatted with Moadou's another good buddy of mine, and Heath Pierce, a number of guys that I'm friends with and that are also involved in this. I kind of track to see how they approach different situations. I think there's a lot of top commentators across our country, and so I kind of listen to see how they approach different situations and try to learn and take what I can from those experiences, and then also strike a balance of like not trying to be somebody else and um yeah, playing to your strengths. Like I think Taylor Twellman's analysis is really top notch, but I can't be Taylor Twellman, right? And if I try to get involved in that, that's going to be a losing battle for me. And so I think everybody similar to playing, you find kind of what your strength is, what makes you unique, how you break down a game, trusting yourself. I think that's a big one because it's live, and I like that pressure. That's part of the feeling that you get from playing, where it's like, all right, you're going to get a replay and you saw it live, trust how you saw it, or be open to changing it as you see the play unfold. And I think that those are some of the basic elements that I've taken on so far. And then I try to review when I can, not during Leagues Cup because there was no time, but I try to review my work, take feedback on when I get it, and then just kind of learn by doing, because I think ultimately it's your responsibility to get better. And I think the same thing with playing. I didn't have like my hand held growing up really to get better. Same thing, surely in MLS, like I had some resources available to you, but I think the environment alone, you have to be able to improve and get better just from the environment and from doing it. And so I haven't really looked to see if somebody's gonna like hold my hand to get better at this. Like I'm kind of taking that on board as something I have to do just by learning and using all the resources that I have available to myself to try to improve on my own.
I think a lot of people would kind of attest that that's the best way to learn about something, is to just kind of keep going and make mistakes as you go and just learn from them and learn from them the right way the first time you make that mistake so you don't ever do it again. I know, speaking with a number of people professionally and as players, that's kind of how they operated as well. It was just like, oh, maybe I came from such and such, like not the best situation. This was my way to get out of that situation. Or I have coached a few kids myself, and I know that one of them, and he's ended up being the best player in his family. He was like 8 years old, like 7 years younger than his next closest brother. And he's got three older brothers that literally just put him in goal and they just shoot the ball at him all the time. And so he had to get better. And now he's ended up being the best player in his family. Um, so that's definitely the way I think that drives the most growth in any career, any position, is to just kind of figure it out on your own and see what works. And obviously, if there's people to help you along the way and give you a little bit of guidance here and there, that's going to help dramatically. But those things of learning on your own of what works and doesn't work is kind of the biggest theme that we've seen across everybody that we've spoken to.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is just like um from your guys' perspective too, it's like nobody's forcing you to do this podcast, right? Like there was nobody that came to you and was like, all right, what are you guys gonna do? Like for an assignment, right? But I think the fact that you're doing this shows that, like, one, you're passionate about it, two, you have the follow through to go for it, and then three, you're building your experience doing it. And so that's kind of the model that I follow too, where it's like I want to do I want to do storytelling. But I didn't wait for somebody's opportunity. You know, when the phone rang, I was ready. I'd been preparing and I took those chances. And I think the same thing, but I don't think there's anything to replace like the passion or the kind of like impetus to just go for it on your own. And then when you get the opportunities to go at a higher level, like you're ready to meet that level, and then you don't get complacent either at that point as well.
Yeah. And then just kind of looking forward a little bit, now, I know specifically with Apple TV and MLS Season Pass, I am I've favorited Cincinnati. So I get to see all of the supporter section of what goes on there. And I know they've got a series called Jung de Juvent, which I think means like all together, or which kind of embodies what the club and the city was about as a soccer community before the MLS team came into play. I also know that a lot of other teams have that kind of thing going for them. And Apple has done a great job of telling those stories that you kind of were focusing on, those kind of untold stories, a little bit of history of those clubs. And that seems to me like they're trying to get people involved on a cultural level with the sport. And I think that that's where a lot of the sport has that's a lot of what the sport has been missing, especially compared to other countries, and just on the international scene, is that the sport isn't interwoven with the culture of our country yet. And that's kind of what we're missing a little bit. What do you think needs to change in the US for that to happen? And then also, are there any kind of other, this is kind of a little sneaky question, are there any projects that we're not aware of at Apple or within the league that are either underway or being talked about to try and get soccer to be more part of like the culture of people in the big cities, or even just playing more on the streets? Because I know that's one of the things we're missing a lot of.
Yeah, I think so I think from the standpoint of I think it just takes time. I think that'd be the biggest thing because when I just think about, growing up in the Bay Area and what I had available to me, and I really didn't even think about ML. I mean, MLS didn't exist when I was growing up and when I fell in love with soccer. And so now I think about like a 7-year-old in Atlanta doesn't know any reality that doesn't include Atlanta United and sold out stadiums and Cincinnati, like that's normal for them now. That's just like exactly the way it's supposed to be. And that's kind of how it is when you grow up in another country, or you grow up and your father was a supporter of a team, or maybe, had some affiliation to it, or your grandparent and it's like a part of your family identity. And I grew up going to, St. Louis City games, or I grew up going to Columbus Crew games. Like that's like a new development. And I think now more and more, I just think the US, we want to be the best at everything immediately. And it doesn't always work that way, we're finding, but I think we're on the right path. And so that part to me is exciting. I think that storytelling side of it. I see a lot of the clubs taking that on, and I think they know their team the best. So that makes sense to me. As far as developing into the larger project at MLS and Apple, like one of the best things that I like about this project is like in the match broadcasts, one, they just look amazing. So that's a huge step forward from before, where I felt like MLS didn't always have that nice packaging. I think of it from like an Apple perspective. Like I have all of the boxes from all the iPhones and iPads and stuff that I bought over the years, and I'm like, I need to throw this away. My apartment in Brooklyn is not big enough. Why am I holding on to this? But I'm like, the packaging is nice. I didn't want to just throw this away. And I just felt like MLS needed a little bit of that sheen of just like, oh, this looks good. And this looks premier, like top class, um, really top picture quality. And then I think the other part of it is like in the broadcast, we try to show, I see a lot of like the Bailey behind the goal, or Seattle plays Portland. And like that is a huge selling point of going to an MLS game, which I've been to like Brooklyn Nets games or NBA games. And it's just like, it's okay. There's like the kiss cam and all these, acrobatics on the pitch or on the court and all this fun stuff, but it's like not really about the atmosphere is kind of posh and the tickets are really expensive, and it's an experience, but it's not the same as what soccer brings. And I think that experience is something that has become a much bigger part of the core of what MLS is, and I see that translating more onto the screens so far. But I think there's more room to grow there too. So I'm hopeful that there will be more storytelling opportunities. I know like Taylor Twellman has a podcast called Offside that goes a little bit deeper into some storytelling, and he's got a broad swath of contacts and people that he's brought on there that have been pretty interesting so far. And there's another show called Breakaway that's been good. I saw a feature just recently on Diego Luna in Salt Lake that I thought was cool. So I think it's just kind of scratching the surface still, and but I think there's a lot more possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point at the beginning there about the 7-year-old today versus the 7-year-old, 20 years ago. We were speaking, we always ask people about the sort of next like 5, 10, 15 years of the tournaments coming, the players that'll come, and how that gets harnessed. But when we were speaking with Tim McDermott last week, or actually the beginning of this week, who's the president of Philadelphia Union, he was, I think, the first one that really just highlighted that it might be more of just time, right? And I think your point kind of painted the picture there of like 15, 20 years ago, yeah, you didn't grow up with these, soccer specific 40,000 plus seating stadiums that are getting sold out every week versus now, like you're growing up in that environment that you might grow up in Europe where like your local team is a big deal. It's not just, playing at a high school or a college pitch and there's, 900 people coming every week. So I think that's a really good point, that it might just be not necessarily all of these tactical initiatives, and it's really just like as the game grows, that'll just come naturally. The way that I'm sure NFL and MLB and NHL all did way back at the beginning of their first couple of decades. But we've looked ahead, obviously, with you before we get into wrapping up and the quick fire side of things that David mentioned to you. One question I would love to ask is, you're obviously in the middle of this new phase of your career. You've had your playing career behind you and you've got so much ahead. But when you look backwards at everything you've done, is there any specific moment or project or thing you've been a part of that has made you the most proud in yourself?
That's a good one. I don't know. I keep going back. I mean, I think for me, like the college experience was really fun. I know that the pro experience is amazing, and that's like where you get to realize your dreams. But I think growing up in Berkeley, playing for Berkeley meant a lot to me. And college soccer is not in the same place as it was, where it's kind of been put a bit on the back burner. I still think it has an important role to play. And there's a lot of players that maybe are not identified right away. Or I even think I did a movement episode where I interviewed Jack Harrison in the UK, and like he went to Wake Forest and like was not picked immediately, and now is playing in the Premier League every week. And so I think there's just always going to be kind of the path less chosen, but that was for me, that was a big chance where I hadn't really gotten a lot of opportunities up until that point. I wasn't recruited to college. I walked to the camp, and that's how I impressed the coach that weekend and ended up finding my way onto the team. And then from there, took that and ran with it, and got some great coaching. That was probably the first time I had real coaching and instruction and understanding how to move and how to like use my ability. Um, so I think my time at Cal and helping build that program is something I'm really proud of. And then I think more than anything for me, like being on a team in MLS, and the best time I would say of my career was in Houston, and like that experience of playing on a winning team that fights for trophies. We got really close to getting some, and more than anything, we talked about the history. When I arrived in Houston, the expectation I felt was to go for trophies because they had won two titles already in MLS Cup. And so I was like, oh, I liked the pressure of being on a team that was the expectation. And then having to earn the respect of, first and foremost, I think your teammates, but then also your manager and then the supporters as well, too. And that was the best experience I had for sure as a professional. And getting a chance to do it at the highest level in the biggest of games, against David Beckham and Landon Donovan, Robbie Keane, Omar Gonzalez, Mike McGee, all these really good players in MLS history, Todd Donovan. I could go down the list. So I think just like from from going from kind of not the most highly regarded to then getting a chance to play at the highest level in our country. But more than anything, being a part of a winning team, that feeling is something that I've held on to for sure. And I think as I look back, that's probably be what I'd be most proud of my playing career. I'm hoping for the media side that moment's still ahead. And I think that's kind of what I try to tell myself to keep driving forward, because playing eventually you do unfortunately meet the end. Although I do still play for fun in New York here. There's like a bunch of ex MLS guys and we get together and try to move as best as we can. I'm still out there trying to, now I'm actually getting back to playing more like, having more fun with it and trying some stuff, and you don't have to worry about if it doesn't come off. Um, but I'm hoping that that you can still grow in media, which is the fun part of like there if you keep pushing, the best moment can still be ahead. Whereas playing, eventually you got to call it, and that moment kind of generally doesn't end on your own terms necessarily. So, but yeah, I'm still hungry and hoping that there's something more out there for me.
Awesome. Well, now we don't want to take too much of your time, and I know you do have kind of a hard stop coming up here in the next 15 minutes or so. So I think we'll move into the quick fire questions. But first, I just want to say thank you, Calen, for coming on. Your career, not just as a player, but as someone within the media of our sport that we love, has been awesome to follow. Seeing all the projects that you've worked on from the start to where you are now, and all the storytelling that everyone within the league does and that you're a part of is awesome. And it's just going to be great for the growth of our sport, especially since the longevity of this project between the league and Apple is kind of something we haven't seen before in terms of a partnership. So it's going to be really cool to see what comes to fruition with that.
Thanks, man.
But to get into the quick fire questions, the first one I have for you is, now that you're on the road all the time, traveling around the country, going to all these different cities, what is your favorite city to visit when you are on the road for work? Like, you see it come up on your schedule and you're like, oh yeah, I can't wait to go here.
Wow, that's a good one. Um, I think the one that's standing out to me is Montreal. Um, in the summer. You got to qualify that because I've been in the winter and it's brutal. But summertime, Montreal is I've been doing a bunch of games up there. The stadium is cool. It's like Stade Saputo is the name, and it's not the fanciest, newest stadium in MLS, but I kind of like that. It's like it's a little sweaty. It's not perfect. It's small. I think it's the smallest stadium in MLS, so it's intimate field and feeling around the ground. They have good support. Team hasn't been as good as it probably could be, at least the last few years. They had a good year a few years ago, and then the city itself, it's like it feels like you're going to Europe because there's the French speaking component, the Quebecois, there's good food, some good sports pubs. And yeah, it's just like the old city is generally where we stay. So I'm right kind of in the mix and walk around the cobblestone streets and have a few friends. One of the video guys I had described before on the movement, he lives there. So he'll take me out to kind of the in the know places. So yeah, I would say Montreal has got to be, that's the one that's popping up for me. But every once in a while, I'll get a trip to the West Coast. And you guys know I love the Bay Area. So even if I had a game in LA, I'd sneak back up to Berkeley. So I keep an eye out for those, but Montreal has been probably my favorite so far this year.
That is kind of consistent with a lot of people that I've talked to, just kind of on the inside. It's like one of those sneaky ones that you wouldn't really guess. It's like, obviously everyone likes New York, everyone likes LA, Chicago, those types of things. But a lot of the teams that aren't in those big cities, they do kind of live in those unique little spots where there's a lot of specific culture to go see and stuff like that. And Montreal is one that everybody kind of highlights. Okay, so you've been in the league or in and around the league for quite a number of years now. What is your favorite rivalry? It could be one that's been going on from the beginning, or one that's just kind of blossoming now.
Oh man, see, now you're testing me because you're like, oh, you chose the deep cut for this, but then I'm like, can I go El Tráfico? Um, I think right now, I mean, I love the history of Seattle, Portland. I love, honestly, Montreal, Toronto. I think one of the best series I ever saw was between them in the playoffs to go to MLS Cup, that back and forth. Being from the Bay Area, those San Jose versus LA Galaxy, the Cali Clasico. That was like top notch for a while. But I also think rivalries are pretty fluid. So I remember playing in Houston and we were rivals with Sporting Kansas City. So it wasn't really so much Dallas because we beat those guys all the time. It was really Sporting because they were the ones that decided who was going to go to MLS Cup like 4 years in a, or no, 3 years in a row. And we mostly got the better of them too. But I think right now I have to go with El Tráfico. Just like what LAFC has brought and the way that they've kind of pushed the Galaxy to bring the best out of themselves. I think that's kind of what rivalries can do in MLS. And um, the Galaxy kind of fell on hard times for a while, and now I think are climbing their way back up. But LAFC, they still got the better of LAFC for a while, and it didn't matter where they were in the table, and it was always just box office. I mean, Zlatan was a big part of that, the way it started. So I'd put that up there. But I don't know. The OG in me also wants to say Seattle, Portland because I do respect that history, but they haven't really had that same energy as of late as I've seen in the past, where it's like there's that real, I don't know, it just feels that like doesn't have that same juice that it had in the past, at least. So I'm gonna stick with El Tráfico.
Awesome. I think Matt, I think you can echo that one as well, but that's the one that definitely grabs the most attention and has had the biggest games definitely over the last few years for sure.
Mhm.
The last quick fire question is, as the season is kind of winding down, and we're getting towards the playoffs and the MLS Cup and whatnot, what is one of the things you are looking forward to in the remainder of 2024, sorry, and that could be professionally or personally?
I mean, for that I'm looking forward to.
Mhm.
I can't, I mean, I know I'm trying to be not just the mainstream guy, but I mean, is Lionel Messi coming back? Is that okay? I just got to be honest because you can't take it for granted. And we've talked a lot on this podcast about the opportunity at hand. And for a while I was more on the other side where I was like, it can't just be Messi, guys. We have to do more than just Messi. The league is not just Messi. But then I think that now I'm like, Columbus is getting a ton of pub, as rightly they should, and they've been one of the best stories. I should have mentioned their Hell is Real derby as another one that's like thrown itself into the mix. And I still think has another, I think over the next few years, like both of those teams are going to be fighting for the top of the Eastern Conference. So, but you don't know what's going to happen, but you don't know how long Messi is going to be here. I think he's got another year after this. Um, but to throw what's already been a really interesting season, to throw Messi back into the mix down the stretch, and I saw just today he's like out on the pitch training again. Um, you just have to see if he can do that, and like if he doesn't win a trophy, I think MLS Cup in his time in MLS, it'll still be. There's no way to say Messi coming here is not a success, but I think it's different that Beckham got MLS Cup and two of them at that. So I think that that piece of it is still like the biggest question mark still of this season, at least. Um, for me personally, I'm trying to focus on my side of things. So I want to get some playoff games if possible. To just like I thought of that same way as a player of like make the playoffs. I think I made 8 of 9 years, only 1 year in Chicago where I didn't make the playoffs, and that next year I moved to Houston, and so I was like, all right, I'm out at the right time. And Chicago has continued to struggle, unfortunately. Not because of me, just because the direction of things have gone there for that club. So yeah, I think for me, I'm just looking towards trying to finish my own part of the season strong and get into the playoffs and see what I can do there. And then, but I think overall, like, what does the Messi era bring? The eyeballs that could bring down the stretch, and then also I think this Miami team's a fun team to root against. If you're a fan of any other team, it's like they've gone out and gotten every major. I mean, Messi's so lovable, which makes it hard, but Suarez is definitely not. So it's like if you want to think of like a sort of a bad guy, I think this Miami team and their like sort of trendy pink jerseys and all that is like a pretty easy team to turn against. I'd probably say the same thing for LAFC too. Um, And so I think there's some like nice it turns everybody into an underdog in a way. And I think that's an interesting dynamic because MLS in the past has not always been so easy to predict, and hasn't had that sort of top end, like, oh, everybody's going after Man City type thing. And I think that dynamic can be useful in the sense of like, it gives everybody a team to root against. And then, yeah, to see more of Messi, it's like in the United States, it's kind of a once in a generation or lifetime opportunity.
Yeah, that's a perfect answer. So I just want to say thank you, Calen, for coming on. We'll hang on for a little bit. I'll just stop the recording and we'll hang on the call. But yeah, just want to say thank you for coming on. Thank you for taking time out of your day. I know you've got a super busy schedule as we kind of touched on in the call. So just appreciate your time and then best of luck with the rest of the season.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate you guys. Love the podcast, love the show, and really appreciate you guys having me on and giving me the chance to dive deeper into some of my story. And yeah, excited to follow along your ride as you continue to put out episodes.
Thanks, Calen. Appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Off the Pitch. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to drop us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. Your support truly means the world to us, and it helps us bring you more of the stories that you love from the business world of soccer. And if you have a moment, please also drop us a rating or a review, as it helps us understand what you like, and it also helps other like-minded individuals find this podcast. See you in the next episode.